Over on Jaguar Gatorade, a new college football video is out. In this video, we talk about the bizarre way that Cal got invited to the Alamo Bowl in 1993. Click the card in the upper right corner to watch. And now, on with our feature presentation. October 7th, 1979. It's week 6 of the NFL season, and we have an interconference game on our hands over at Candlestick Park between the Seattle Seahawks and the San Francisco 49ers. Of all the games on the calendar during this week, this was definitely the least attractive of the bunch, and I think that's putting it lightly. In one corner, you had the Seahawks, who were sitting dead last in the AFC West with a 1-4 record, who were coming off of a 3-possession loss at home at the hands of the Kansas City Chiefs, and who had one of the worst offenses in the conference, being 4th from the bottom with 93 points scored for an average of just over 18 points per game, and one of the worst defenses in the conference as well, being 3rd from the bottom with 123 points allowed for an average of just under 25 points per game. And in the other corner, you had the San Francisco 49ers, one of the laughingstocks in football throughout the second half of the 1970s, and a team that, even though they had a new head coach in Bill Walsh, who you can learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner, was looking just as bad as they had under previous management. The Niners entered this game as one of 4 winless teams in the league, alongside the Baltimore Colts, the Cincinnati Bengals, and the New York Giants, as they were 0-5 through 5 games, boasting an offense that was even worse than Seattle's, and boasting a defense that had allowed 137 points for an average of over 27 points per game, which was not only the worst in the NFC, but was the 3rd worst in the entire NFL, only ahead of the Bengals and the Jets. The game was so underwhelming on paper that Candlestick Park was a sea of empty seats, with less than 45,000 people filling up the stands, and with the game getting blacked out in San Francisco. And when the final whistle sounded, the game was won by the Seahawks, as the 49ers could not get their first win on the board. Seattle won the game by a final score of 35-24, and it wasn't even that close, seeing as the Niners never led at any point, seeing as the Seahawks led it 28-10 after 3 quarters, and seeing as the Seahawks led it 35-17 heading into the final play of the game. San Francisco had no answers whatsoever to stopping the Seahawks on the ground, as the Seahawks scored 4 rushing touchdowns while averaging over 4.1 yards per carry. Seattle's offensive line was nothing short of dominant, as Jim Zorn, despite attempting 20 passes, did not get sacked once. The Seahawks played an extremely clean game, not turning it over while forcing 2 turnovers of their own. And it was another solid day at the office for wide receiver Steve Largent, who was quickly becoming one of the best receivers in all of football, as he ended the game leading both teams with 83 receiving yards. In fact, this game was so bad for the Niners that the only thing worse than their play on the field was their security, as during the game, a fan literally ran onto the field and security did absolutely nothing about it. Seriously, take a look.
Loss in San Diego last week, 31-9. And their 4 previous defeats, if that's any consolation at all, were closer. But I tell you, when you're 0-6, you're dying, no matter what the score is. That's right. Death.
Fun fact about this fan. When he got on the field, the fan, whose name was Steve Foreman, shook hands with wide receiver Freddie Solomon and had a conversation with quarterback Steve DeBerg. As for what he said, Foreman said, "I told the team I love them and the offense is great, but former general manager Joe Thomas traded away all our defense." That's the funniest storming of the field by a fan that I've ever seen in my life. Anyways, that was just one of the bizarre and wacky things that happened during this game. Because the main one we're going to dive into today is the bizarre start time of the game. Because for some reason, this game started at 5 o'clock Eastern, and 2 o'clock in San Francisco. Now that might seem odd on the surface. Games only start at 1 o'clock or 4 o'clock on the East Coast, although you did have 2 o'clock starts in places like Baltimore due to blue laws. But a 5 o'clock start for the 49ers Seahawks game? Why was that the case? Well, it doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. And over 40 years later, it still doesn't make sense. In fact, it makes even less sense when you break down the logic behind it. Because this was NBC's call, and the call made no sense. Because this is the story behind what might just be the strangest scheduling controversy and conflict of the 1979 NFL season. Before I dive into why the game was changed to its rather unusual start time, and why this made no sense whatsoever, we need some context to understand what else was happening elsewhere in the sports world outside of football. The year is 1979, and over in Major League Baseball, there are two teams fighting for the National League pennant and a spot in the World Series. In one corner, you have the Cincinnati Reds. The Reds had been one of the most dominant and consistent teams in the NL throughout the 70s, and in 1979, they won their division, the NL West, for the sixth time this decade, as they finished the year with a 90-71 record, finishing 1.5 games ahead of the Houston Astros for first place. They were led by 5 All-Stars, including 2 future Hall of Famers in Johnny Bench and Joe Morgan. And after a shaky start to the year, where they were 41-41 through the first half at Independence Day, they ended the year as a dominant team, going 49-30 the rest of the way, winning over 62% of their games, and being one of the hottest teams in baseball. And in the other corner, you had the Pittsburgh Pirates, the We Are Family Pirates. They ended the 1979 season as the second best team in baseball during the regular season, going 98-64, winning the NL East for the 6th time in the 70s, just like the Reds, and with their 98 wins being the most they had in a season since all the way back in 1909, which was so long ago that things such as escalators, zippers, and crossword puzzles had not yet been invented. The Pirates had a dominant pitching staff, as they were one of just 4 teams to allow fewer than 4 runs per game on average, and even though they got off to a super rough start, as they were 12-18 through the first 30 games, and were 9 back of the division lead, once they got going, oh man, they got going, as they went 86-46 the rest of the way, winning over 65% of their games, which is an insanely high pace for a baseball team to keep up over the course of a long period of time. That's about a 106 win pace. For the 4th time this decade, the NLCS to determine a spot in the World Series was going to be between the Pittsburgh Pirates out of the East and the Cincinnati Reds out of the West. The Reds won the series in 1970, 1972, and 1975. And now, it was Pittsburgh's turn to try and get revenge. The only problem as it came to MLB with the NFL? The 5th game of the NLCS, if it went the distance in the best-of-5 series, was going to be televised on NBC on Sunday, October 7th at 1:15 p.m. Eastern. Obviously, that's an issue, because you can't televise 2 games at the same time. While this wouldn't necessarily be an issue for the 1 o'clock games, because NBC would just not air any 1 o'clock games that week, and instead would just air the late slate of games, almost like how CBS did it back on November 15th, 2020, when they had to air final round coverage of the Masters on the same day as football, and would just air a single header that week. What about the 4 o'clock games? A 1:15 start time is a really odd time for a baseball game, because if you assume that the average baseball game takes 3 hours to complete, it's not ending until 4:15. Plus, you'll have post-game ceremonies and coverage to hand out the trophy, so it could wind up being more than 3 hours. And on top of that, there's no time limit in baseball, and you could play forever with extra innings. Heck, 2 of the first 3 games in the NLCS went into extra innings, and took well over 3 hours to complete because of this. In other words, with NFL games in the late package starting at 4 o'clock, there's going to be some massive overlap. Realizing that this was an issue, NBC worked out a deal with 49er officials, solely for television reasons, so that people wouldn't have to miss the start of the 49ers game due to baseball coverage running long. They agreed to move the game back 1 hour, moving it from its original start time of 4 o'clock Eastern, or 1 o'clock Pacific, to 5 o'clock Eastern, or 2 o'clock Pacific. Alright, that seems like an insanely logical and reasonable solution to a problem. Just push the game back an hour, and that way, just about everyone's happy. It might be a problem on the East Coast if you push the game back an hour, since it cuts into the local news and Sunday night programming. But on the West Coast, if you started it at a normal time, the game is over at 4 o'clock. No one airs anything of quality at 4 o'clock on a weekend. If you move it back an hour so NBC has to put its regular programming on the West Coast for those who got the game on at 5 o'clock, it's no big deal. So that's why the game started at 5 o'clock Eastern instead of 4 o'clock. Easy enough, right? Well, not quite. Because there are quite a few problems with this that, to this day, make no sense, and might baffle those who were forced to adjust their Sunday plans by a bit, and maybe adjust their dinner reservations that they had for that night. For one, oh yeah, there was no Game 5 in the NLCS. Last time I checked, NBC and the 49ers agreed to do this so as not to cause a conflict with Game 5. However, Game 5 could only happen if the series was tied at 2 apiece, and that was not the case here, as the Pirates, as you can tell from these highlights, swept the Reds in 3 games, taking the first game by a final score of 5-2 in 11 innings, taking the second game by a final score of 3-2 in 10 innings, and winning on their home field and taking Game 3 by a final score of 7-1. So this meant that instead of airing this game and then the football game, you'd be airing absolutely nothing, since you're not going to start a game, show the first hour, and then cut away from it. I mean, you could do that, but I think NBC learned its lesson back in 1971 when they did that with a regular season finale between Washington and Cleveland, and it backfired in spectacular fashion, which you can learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner. But okay, maybe all of the games that were airing on NBC were pushed back to 5 o'clock instead of 4 o'clock, and I'm just making a mountain out of a molehill here. But here's the crazy part. That wasn't the case at all. That week, there were 4 games that were televised by NBC that were in the late time slot, which is traditionally 4 o'clock Eastern. One of them was the AFC East battle between the New York Jets and the Baltimore Colts, which the Colts won by a final score of 10-8. That game started at 4 o'clock Eastern. Another one was the AFC Central battle between the Pittsburgh Steelers and the Cleveland Browns, which the Steelers won in an unusually high-scoring affair by a final score of 51-35. You'd think that of all the games, that this would make the most sense to push back, seeing as the Steelers had direct ties in the city to the baseball game, as the Pirates would have been playing in Game 5 if it got to that point. However, that game started at 4 o'clock Eastern. And the third one was the AFC West battle between the Denver Broncos and the San Diego Chargers, which the Broncos won by a final score of 7-0. I guess the Steelers-Browns game stole all the points from the other 2 games. You think that this one would also make sense to push back for the aforementioned West Coast reasons, seeing as no one is airing anything of substance on a Sunday at 4 o'clock when the game would have ended. However, this one also started at 4 o'clock Eastern. This meant that the Seahawks 49ers game was quite literally the only game that was airing at 5 o'clock Eastern, and was starting 1 hour later, even though 3 other games were in the exact same scheduling predicament with NBC, and in some cases, they might have had it worse. It made no logical or practical sense whatsoever. Usually, when there is a bizarre kickoff time with one game in particular, there's a very clear-cut explanation as to why that game was the exception. The stadium was being used by another team the night before, and they needed time to change it over, as was the case with the situation involving the Oakland Raiders in 2013, which you can learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner. There were blue laws that prevented the game from starting before a certain time. The game got postponed for one reason or another to a different day, and the game was played at a weird time to avoid television conflicts, either with other programming on the network or with other NFL games. We saw this a lot with the random weekday afternoon games during the 2020 season impacted by COVID. But this, what we saw from the 49ers Seahawks game in 1979, it truly makes no sense. The game was postponed due to a completely non-existent scheduling conflict that never came to fruition, was postponed due to a game that never wound up happening. And the game was, quite literally, the only game being impacted by this, even though other games that were in the same boat and were facing the same exact conflict were just fine, and started at their regular time. It's a mystery that makes no sense, and still makes no sense more than 40 years later. Today, the NFL is king, and I think that goes without saying. The NFL bows down to no one. They not only win in the ratings against baseball, and quite handily I might add, but the World Series now refuses to schedule games on Sunday in order to avoid playing on the same day as the NFL. But back in 1979, clearly, that was not the case. Because when it came to the battle between the San Francisco 49ers and the Seattle Seahawks, the NFL lost, in rather bizarre fashion, to a game that didn't exist. Get your official Jaguar Gator 9 merchandise by going to jg9shop.com, and be sure to like this video, ring the notification bell, and subscribe down below if you haven't already, as it helps the channel out a lot. And be sure to check out Twitch every Wednesday night at 9 p.m. Eastern for your chance to play NFL trivia and win cash prizes. Link in the description below. If you want to see videos like this condensed down to 60 seconds, then follow me on TikTok at Jaguar Gator 9. To see college football videos, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 8. To see highlight videos of players throughout the history of the NFL, subscribe to JG9 Highlights. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. So you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.